Okay, so in this video we're going to be looking at getting a couple of Juniper SRX appliances set up for remote management, DHCP, and let us start configuring them for some more interesting projects here down the road. Now it's a pretty simple setup of what I have, so I've created basically two networks here. We've got the LAN network, which goes from NIC 1 to the Windows 10 host, so we can treat that as our sort of internal administration machine. And I've also created a WAN network that goes from NIC 0 to NIC 0 on the second firewall. So we're going to treat those as remote networks. We can do some things with VPNs and that style of setup. Now the configuration is a little bit different because we don't have direct console access like we would with a normal console cable. So we're going to have to repeat some of our efforts moving from the first firewall onto the second firewall, but we can discuss that when we get there. So I'm just going to start out right away on this first firewall, so the one that's connected to both the LAN and the WAN. And we'll jump into here and just kind of go through that basic configuration. So when we pull it up, of course, the default login is root, and there's no password on it. So to move from the BSD mode into the command line, we just type CLI, and we should be at that kind of administrative mode. Now, just before we start, let's look at the configuration to see what we're working with out of the box, and we can identify some areas that we're going to need to change here. So if I do a show configure, or show configuration rather, we can kind of step through this and see what we have. So right now we can see that we have SSH and HTTP access enabled on the gig 0 interface. So that's going to be our outside interface. For our configuration on the first firewall, we're going to want to set that up on the inside, but we can leave it on the outside for the second firewall temporarily. And as we keep going down through that, we just have the one interface configured with the unit 0 and no IP address on it. So we'll need to get our second NIC added into that. The security screens and policies we shouldn't need to mess with too much here, but we may need to do a little bit of work on our actual zones that we have configured. So this looks pretty good. The outside interface is in the untrust zone. We'll come back a little bit later and add the trust zone for our internal host to start to work with the firewall on the inside of the network. So first things first, let's get into our configuration mode. And we'll start working with the IP addresses and some of those types of things. The first thing we have to do though is set up a root authentication password. Otherwise we won't be able to save our configurations down the road. So we're going to do a set system root authentication plain text password, and it's going to ask us just for our password twice. So I'm going to go with the standard password 1 exclamation point with a capital P. So obviously not the best password, but just for the sake of the demo, that should work just fine. So the next thing that we're going to want to do is go set up our interfaces to have IP addresses on them. So I'm going to start out with that outside interface. So let's go into our edit interfaces, and I will do set interface. Rather, we want to do a set GE 000. So that was our outside interface. Unit 0, and we can just go with the standard IPv4 address, so family, inet, address, and then just choosing an outside IP address. So 138.247, let's do 98.49. And let's make that a slant 29. Perfect. I also want to set up a inside interface as well, because we're going to eventually put DHCP on this network so that our Windows 10 host can get an address through that. So I'm just going to up arrow, we'll get rid of this IP address, and let's make our inside network on this side of things just something simple like 1.1. We'll make that a slant 24. And of course, I need to set this for my inside interface, which we looked at previously. The one connected to the LAN network in vCloud was gig 001. Excellent. So let's just do a show real quick. Since we're in the edit interfaces, we should see the new changes that we had just made. And everything's looking good so far. So we can move on to our next set of steps. Now I want to get my Windows 10 machine onto the network with DHCP just to make things a little bit easier. So we're going to go ahead and set up the DHCP server on this firewall. So we're going to back out of interfaces, and we're going to set up the system services DHCP local server. So we'll do set system services DHCP-local server. We can create a DHCP group. It doesn't really matter, so I might call this something like LAN. Let's do this so it's a little easier to see. So LAN DHCP, and which interface are we going to hand these addresses out on? I want to do this on my inside network, so we're going to go with GE 001, and it's going to be on unit 0. Okay. Next thing we have to do is go into the actual address pool. So we're going to create the pool for those inside hosts. We're going to specify what network ID it should live on, the low and the high ranges of IP addresses we're going to use, how much they're going to have for release time, and we can set up things like the name server as well. So I'm going to actually just jump a little bit farther down in that config hierarchy and get into the address assignment pool. So we're going to go edit access, address assignment, pool, and we'll give it a name. So I'm going to say just LAN pool. And then after that, we'll set up the family inet attributes. So family inet. And you can see we've jumped down into that actual level of config. It'll just save us a little bit of typing here, so hopefully this is a little bit easier. Now, if we look at what options that we can actually set on this, there's not a ton that we need to set up with this. So if I do a set question mark, you can see things like we have the network, the range, any of the XAuth attributes will come into play when we actually start setting up VPNs and things like that. But for now, just the basics, we need to specify the network that we're going to hand out addresses in. And so if we kind of match what we had for the internal address of this firewall, the network ID would be 1.0, and that's a slant 24. We'll set up the range as well, and we just give it a name. So I'm going to say LAN range, and we can say the low address that we want to hand out is maybe 1.100. This, it's only going to have one host, so it doesn't matter if it's a very big range. We can set the high range of that would be, and let's just go to 200. Okay, that should be all that we need there. We could set up some of the things like the DHCP attributes. So you can see you could do like a lease time. You can set up your default gateway, things like that. So let's actually go ahead and do that. So let's go DHCP attributes, router. This will be my default gateway. So of course we want that to be the firewall. We could set up the name server as well. So we don't really have DNS running in this network, but no big deal. If we were going to set it up on our firewall, we could do that. You could use a public DNS like Google's or anything, but this should be just fine for that. So what I want to do now is I want to go back to the top and just kind of see what we've actually set. So I'm going to do a show, and then we can do, let's see here, get out of that. If we just do a show, we can see our whole candidate configuration that we're going to have. So we see our root authentication password. We see our system services. So we've got our DHCP server on the inside address. HTTP is enabled on the outside. We can see our IP addresses and everything like that. So let's do our commit check just to make sure that we haven't messed anything up or we're not missing anything. Okay, so everything looks good. And we can do a commit comment. We'll say something like added IPs and DHCP for LAN. That way, if we have to roll back to something, we can pretty easily get back out that way. Okay, so our configuration there is done. Let's check to make sure that our DHCP actually worked. So if we just temporarily minimize this and go to our Windows 10 host, we might have to do an ipconfig release renew to see if we've got an address, but we can certainly check that out. So let's take a look at our adapters here. Just make sure that we're set up for DHCP to begin with. Okay, and it looks like it should be requesting a DHCP address. If we go into our command prompt and just do an ipconfig, we have nothing there, so let's do a release and ipconfig renew. So hopefully what we're going to see is this will come back and actually give us an address. One thing we might need to actually go set is to allow the DHCP requests to come into the firewall. So we can take a look at that here as soon as we find out the results of how this request is going to go. Alright, so this doesn't look like it's probably going to go. It hasn't timed out quite yet, but typically a DHCP request is not going to take this long for it. So while we're waiting for this, we can actually go look at the firewall and see where we might need to start making some of these changes. So for the time being, while that's still thinking about it, we'll go back to the firewall and take a look. Okay, so when I do a show, we get our whole candidate configuration again. And one thing that we might need to change here is if we go down to our actual security zones, you're going to see that we don't have a zone really defined for the trust with anything in it. So when looking at the security zones here, you can see that the gig001 interface is not tied to it, and therefore no services are really going to be allowed inbound to it. So we're kind of going to mimic that untrust zone and get DHCP added into the trust side of things. So we'll do a edit security zones, security zone, and it's trust. We're going to add in the interface. That'll be GE001, and we just want to do the .0 after to specify unit 0. And we can jump right into the host inbound traffic. Now what we can do here is we can go into the set system services, and we can start adding all of those services to be allowed from our LAN hosts to the firewall. For the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to allow all system services, because if it's on my trusted LAN, we really should be doing egress firewalling, but for right now we're just going to trust all of those. Okay, so let's do a show here. You can see that we've added all system services. So we'll do a commit check. Everything looks good. And then we'll say added all services to trust zone. After we get this, we can go back and test our DHCP request again. Okay, so that's still thinking about it, so let's just stop that and we'll start it again here. And hey, this is a pretty good sign that we've actually detected and are up on a network. And we can see that we've got an address that's in our correct DHCP scope. Real quick, we can see if we can ping that firewall. Since we allowed all system services inbound, we should have no problems setting that up to ping. Now the next two things that I wanted to do was set this firewall up for SSH access and specifically HTTP access so we can get in and start to configure some things that way. Now right now we're not going to be able to SSH or hit the web management because our firewall is configured not to allow that. We can verify that again if we go back to this firewall and we can go to the top level. And if we just do a show again, we'll see how this is set up. So right here you can see in the middle that web management is enabled via HTTP, and it's only enabled on the outside interface. We're going to get rid of that config and enable it on the inside interface as well. Now SSH is enabled as well, but it's not really set up, so we're going to go change some of the properties of that too. But one step at a time, let's start with the web management. So we're going to go into Edit System, Services, and we want to go into Web Management. So we'll take it one more step down in that config, and we're going to do a delete HTTP. When I do a show now, we can see that there's no web management set up whatsoever. So I want to do set HTTPS, and we're going to set this up on the interface GE 001 for the inside. And we can just do this on the .0 actually. Should be just fine. If I do a show, wants us to know what certificate that we're going to use. So we'll do a set. We're going to just use the system generated certificate. So we need to go back into edit system. Let's see where we're at here. Okay, so we're still in web management. So let's do a set HTTPS system generated certificate. Now if we do a show again, we should get rid of that error message. Perfect. We can do a commit check. Make sure that this configuration's gonna go. And we'll do a commit comment. We'll say enabled HTTPS on LAN. All right, perfect. So stepping back over to Windows, we will take a look here and see if we can hit the web management interface for that. So we'll pull up a browser here and go to HTTPS 192.168.1.1. We left it at the default port, so it's going to say, right, since we use that system generated certificate, it's not a trusted certificate, but hopefully we can log in with our credentials that we had set up for the root account. All right, cool. So we've successfully made it into the web management. Now it's obviously not a good idea to be running around as root, so we're going to go back to the firewall one more time here. We're going to set ourselves up with a user account. So we have our own account that's tied to us, so we can kind of get that non-repudiation going. And then we'll set this up for SSH configuration as well. So we can kind of do those two steps in tandem here. So we're going to go closing out of Windows and going back to our SRX. I want to go back up to the top level here, and we can start to set ourselves up with user accounts. So from the top level, I'm just going to go to set user, give myself a username. Let's see, we should probably actually go to set system. There we go, set system login, user. I'll give myself the name of Mike. I'm going to set up the class of user account as being a super user. So giving myself the full privileges to this firewall. So set system login user Mike class super user. And I of course need to set myself up with a password. So I'll do user Mike authentication plain text password. So it wants password, so I'm just going to choose something simple like we did for the root account. Just for the sake of this, we'll do password 1 exclamation point and we should see that we have our new user account created here. Now, last thing I wanted to do was kind of fine-tune that SSH configuration. So let's go into our Edit System Services and go to the SSH config. And if we do a set, we can see some of those options that we have. So a couple things that I want to do is I want to do set root login, and we're going to deny that. Right? We probably don't want the root account SSHing into our firewall, especially when we're making accounts for each user. So we're going to deny that. We're going to set our protocol version to version 2. We know that version 1 has cryptographic weaknesses within it. We'll set up our rate limit and our connection limits as well. So we'll do set rate limit, and let's do 15. So this is how many connections a person can try to make every minute. So let's go 5. And we'll do set connection limit. This is how many people can be SSH'd in at a given time. So we can go 5 with that as well. Now when I do a show, we see all of our changes, and we can do again a commit check. Everything looks good. So we'll do a commit comment and just say enabled SSH configuration. Alrighty, perfect. So jumping back over to Windows here, make sure that we can actually SSH into this firewall. So as we get Windows logged in here, we'll go to PuTTY, and we should just be able to use that inside IP address 192.168.1.1. Comes up, we haven't trusted this key before. Again, we're using that system generated certificate, and so I should be able to log in with my new account here. Excellent. Just to make sure we've got all of our permissions, I can get into configuration mode and exit back out of that. This firewall is basically set up for us now. There's not really a whole lot left that we should need to do for it. So let's run through the configuration one more time to make sure there's nothing left we need to clean up. And then after that, we can go take a look at getting into that second firewall to allow some remote configuration there. So I'm going to change this font size so we can actually see what we're working on a little bit better. So make this just a little bit bigger. Okay, so let's do a show configuration. Okay, so we've got our root password. I've got just my one user account. Looking at our services, SSH looks like it's set up correctly. Nothing extra in DHCP or web management. We've removed the HTTP access for the more secure HTTPS. The logging we didn't really need to change anything with, so we can kind of keep moving on. Interface IPs look fine. The security screens are things like how to identify SYN floods or denial of service type things. So for that, we should be fine. Our policies are default from our couple of zones that we have, just the trust and untrust zone. In our trust zone, we're allowing everything inbound to the firewall. On the untrust zone, we could do a little cleanup here, but maybe we'll do that another time. We probably don't really need HTTP access from the outside, SSH, Telnet, DHCP, things like that. We probably don't need those. Of anything, HTTPS and DHCP would be the two that we could leave within that. But for now, we'll keep moving on. Our DHCP configuration looks fine, and so this firewall we're going to call configured. Now real quick, we're going to go to that second firewall and just make sure that we can actually access that remotely here from this Windows 10 machine. So we are going to have some of those things like HTTPS and SSH enabled on the outside, but what we would want to set up maybe in the future is getting a VPN established so that to configure that firewall or really make any changes, we need to successfully authenticate to the VPN and protect ourselves a little bit more from the kind of outsider threats. So on this firewall, we'll just do the couple of kind of basics for it. So we're going to log in with root. Again, there's no password on it or anything. So we'll go through this configuration a little bit quicker than that first one. So first thing we need to do, set up our system root authentication with a plain text password. Okay, so we've got that. We'll set up our IP address for the outside interface. So we'll do a set system interfaces, we'll go set interfaces, GE, and that's going to be 000 unit 0, and we're just dealing with IPv4, so family INET. And the address, we want to be on the same subnet that our first firewall was, so we could do something like 138.247.98.50, and I believe we had a slant 29 for that. Okay, so let's do a show here real quick and see what else we need to set up. I want to further define SSH, and again we'll remove the HTTP management. We'll switch that to be HTTPS. So we can set up that stuff for the remote management here. As far as our firewall policies exist though, if we're going for HTTPS and SSH, those are already enabled in the untrust zone, so there's going to be a little bit less work for that. So we'll go into our edit system services, SSH first. We can start with that, and we'll set up our few options that we had done before. So we'll do a set root login, and we're just going to deny that outright. We wanted to set our protocol version to version 2. We set our rate limit to 5, and our connection limit to 5 as well. And that was all we needed to do for that. Let's go up a level and deal with our web management here. So let's go into Edit, Web Management. We want to get rid of HTTP management altogether, so we don't want unencrypted management of this firewall. We're going to replace that with HTTPS, and we needed to set what certificate we were going to use as well. So again, system generated certificate, and then which interface are we going to listen for these connections coming in on. For right now, we can just do it on gig 000 unit 0, since we don't really have any other interfaces configured. Last thing I want to do is make myself a user account for this as well. So we're going to go into set system login. I'll create the same account that I did on the other firewall, so I'll go user mic, class, and give myself full permission, so super user. I need to set up a password for myself. So I'll do authentication, plain text password. I think I might have mistyped this, so yep, so passwords are not equal. I'll try it one more time. And that looks a little bit better. Okay, so let's do a commit check. Everything looks good, so we'll do a commit comment. And we'll say basic config for HTTPS and SSH. All right, everything looks good there. Now what we can do is we can go test it. Now we might have to test this from the actually the first firewall. We can try it from our Windows host, but I don't believe it's going to know how to actually get to that remote network here. So let's just try real quick and see if we can hit it on the outside interface. So I'm still SSH'd into firewall 1, we'll call it. The new firewall we'll just call firewall 2. So I believe this probably will time out, but we can see. So just using the external IP address. And it doesn't probably look like it's going to connect. We need to set up the basically a default route. No worries though, we can still test this from our first firewall. So if I just do an SSH and we can do the 138.247.98.50. There we can see that the keys come up. We'll trust it. And I'll add in my password. And there we go. So we are able to get into both firewalls. We can work on the routing and things a little bit later on, but basically this is a configuration I wanted just to have some communication and a little bit easier access for management. So that's all I've got for this video. We'll pick it up again with future topics on Juniper.